Well, we would like to welcome Brother Reinmueller. His first name is Alex. His wife's name is Sarah. And, okay, I'll point them out. They're right there, in case you haven't met them. And you can certainly meet them after the meeting. Brother Reinmueller both of them are in Brooklyn, Bethel. He's been in the Canadian Bethel, so you may have run into him in various places. He and his wife were here for the Special Assembly Day, the last one we had up in Denton, so we may remember them from that. Let's plan on meeting them after the meeting. You can greet them and show them our Southern hospitality and our theocratic generosity as we meet them, so we look forward to that. Well, now we'd like to introduce Brother Reinmueller. He's going to talk to us on the theme, What Will You Give for a Blessing? Brother Reinmueller.
Joanna had a problem, and she needed to speak to an elder. Your problems are likely somewhat different than hers, but there are elements to her story that I think every one of us here this afternoon can relate to. Joanna and her husband had spent many wonderful years together, serving Jehovah in the full-time service. After 15 years of marriage, therefore, their home and their lifestyle were still quite spare and simple. But at the end of every day, they came home from their ministry with the simple satisfaction that they were giving their best to Jehovah, and that felt good. They were proud of that. Even when their two sons came along, they felt very blessed to have been allowed to stay on in their assignment. Then, without warning, tragedy struck. Joanna's husband fell unexpectedly sick, and when he could no longer work, they were forced to go into debt just to keep their household going and meet up with the bills. His condition deteriorated rapidly, although the doctors did everything that they could for him at the time. One day they told Joanna to get ready for the worst. Still, nothing prepared her for the day her husband died. Bereavement often triggers a family crisis. On top of the pain of the loss of a loved one, there may also be major debts that are left behind. There is often the sudden reality of being a single parent, something you never expected. And at times, even the loss of cherished theocratic privileges, which is hard to deal with. For Joanna, it was as if one of the legs of the chair she was sitting on had been savagely cut off, and she was thrown completely off balance. What would become of her and her children now, she wondered. She felt disoriented, afraid, angry, as we might well imagine she would. She knew that her husband would come back in the resurrection. She had faith in that, and yet, as the Bible says at Proverbs 13 and 12, expectation postponed is making the heart sick. What had she done wrong, she wondered? Had she lost Jehovah's favor, perhaps, with this sudden turn of events? After having given so much of her life to Jehovah, why did it seem he was abandoning her now? You can imagine how distressing questions like that can be at such a time of intense emotional stress. Whatever the trial, when it appears as if our prayers are not being heard by Jehovah or being answered in the way that we expect, we can easily start feeling vulnerable, abandoned, maybe even rejected by God. Well, what would you say to encourage Joanna if she talked to you about her problems? In some respects, I'm sure you'll agree, her situation is so familiar that she could be any one of us here in this audience today. But she's not. She's a Jewish widow that lived in Samaria over 3,000 years ago. And her experience highlights three important principles that we want to talk about today that relate to obtaining Jehovah's blessing in our life. The three principles are, first of all, blessings come to faithful people. Secondly, when it comes to spiritual blessings, you get what you focus on. And third, the more you give, the more you get from Jehovah. Taken together, these three Bible principles provide a theocratic framework that can help any one of us obtain and maintain Jehovah's blessing in our life. Our theme this afternoon is, what will you give for a blessing? And you'll see how these three principles come together to highlight to each of us as individuals how much really depends on us as individuals. So let's talk about them in a little more detail. Let's begin with the first principle. Blessings come to faithful people. That statement might seem strange to some at first, because when you look at it in our world, our experience is that wicked people often prosper more easily in this system than the righteous do. When bad things happen to good people, it often shakes up our confidence in God, in ourselves, in others. We're talking about divine blessings in our discussions, blessings from Jehovah. So we're not talking about a life free from problems or the things common to mankind. In the context of our discussion, the word blessing here relates to a request made of God for the bestowal of divine favor. As Jehovah's servants, that's what we're interested in. We know we're not leading a charmed life. We know we will have problems, but we want to be sure that we're right with God and that Jehovah is blessing us. So we think of Noah, Abraham, Hannah, David, Jesus, Mary. All of them ask God for specific blessings and receive them. What do we have to do to obtain such blessings in our lives? Well, the Scriptures tell us, rather than thinking about something big, we really need to think about things that are small. It's not one or two big things that we do in life that bring us Jehovah's favor. In reality, it's the small, everyday acts of love, obedience, and loyalty that earn us God's approval. Jesus put it this way: the person faithful in what is least is also faithful in what is much. So we don't have to be someone great or outstanding to be blessed with God. We need to be faithful. Notice how Proverbs 28 and verse 20 makes this important connection for us between divine blessings and faithfulness. That's Proverbs 28 and verse 20. It says simply, a man of faithful acts will get many blessings, but he that is hastening to gain riches will not remain innocent. So this scripture assures us that Jehovah will bless, that is, protect, prosper, guide, or supply the needs of those who are faithful, those who put their full trust or faith in Him. A man of faithful acts will get many blessings, we're assured. It's not maybe, we will. So faithfulness really opens up the way to greater blessings from Jehovah. Now consider how this was true in the Israelite widow situation we introduced in our introduction. Turn with me to the Bible account that tells us about her life experience, 2 Kings chapter 4. We've already set the scene for you about her life, her problems, her predicament. But now let's read right from the Bible what really happened and see what lessons we can learn. In 2 Kings chapter 4 and verse 1, we're told, there was a certain woman of the wives of the sons of the prophets that cried out to Elisha, saying, your servant, my husband, is dead, and you yourself well know that your own servant had continually feared Jehovah. And the creditor himself has come to take both my children for his slaves. So at once, we learn what the woman's predicament is. Not only is her husband dead, but she's about to lose her children to the creditors. But we're also told something about her background. And this is interesting in helping us to understand the situation and how Jehovah deals with it. The widow and her husband has evidently been part of the community known in Israel as the sons of the prophets, and that gives us some clue into their theocratic heritage. Volume 2 of Insight of the Scriptures explains that this phrase, the sons of the prophets, may describe a school of instruction for those called to this vocation, or simply a cooperative association of prophets. So it may help for us to think about this, something similar to a cross between our Gilead school today and Bethel service. Okay, do you have that in mind? Well, Insight continues. The record mentions their building their own dwelling place and the use of a borrowed tool, which may indicate that they lived simply. Well, that sounds even more like Bethel or missionary service, doesn't it? A simple life in full-time service. And finally, the reference concludes, though often sharing quarters and food in common, they might receive individual assignments to go out on prophetic missions. So apparently, this woman's husband had made a good name with Jehovah. He was also well known to Elisha because Elisha was the head of this school of prophets in Gilgal and in Bethel. Elisha knew, as a faithful man, as a man who had feared God continually, that he was someone who could be trusted, relied upon. Probably in his assignments and in their life in this community, he proved to be someone known as a fearer of God. It's possible that her husband had been one of the 7,000 in Israel who had not bent down to Baal or kissed him in Elijah's day, because it's likely that he would have been alive during that time when Jehovah revealed that to Elijah. If that was the case, then Jehovah himself had taken note of his faithfulness and gone on record preserving his approval of this man along with the other in that group in his word, the Bible. What about the widow's faithfulness? For many years, evidently, she had supported her husband in his assignment, like so many of our sisters do today, who willingly forego personal preferences to serve along with their husbands at Bethel or in the traveling work or in foreign missionary service. These sisters also accept the many sacrifices that living a simple communal life calls for, often without complaint. And believe me, it's not easy. It requires sacrifice. And yet thousands of them continually, faithfully serve in these assignments year in, year out, supporting their husbands, carrying out their duties, because they love Jehovah, they love their husbands, and they love Jehovah's work. These too are faithful women in Jehovah's eyes. When their children came along, this couple were not quick to give up their full-time service in return for a more quote-unquote normal way of life. Can you imagine the pressure their relatives must have put on them when they started having children? We can imagine them saying, "You've done your part for Jehovah. It's time for you to settle down now. Children need a stability. They need their relatives around them. Why not move back home to the family homestead and raise your children here? We'll help you get established." Yet despite what others thought, this couple continued to pursue their full-time service career, grateful that Jehovah blessed them with this privilege. A good example. The point of all of this, brothers, is that this family's record of faithfulness did not go unnoticed by Jehovah. True, they didn't have much in the way of material things or material advantages, but clearly Jehovah saw them as being rich spiritually in his eyes. He preserved a record of their faithfulness for us here to examine today. In fact, their faithfulness helped to prepare them for a difficult family crisis, the loss of a husband, father, and provider. Notice how Elisha responds to the widow's urgent cry for help in verse 2. At this, Elisha said to her, "What shall I do for you? Tell me, what do you have in the house?" To this she said, "Your maidservant has nothing at all in the house, but a spouted jar of oil." Elders have to be careful when their brothers and sisters approach them with a problem, not to treat them as if they're helpless. It's especially tempting when a single woman approaches an elder for help, whether she's unmarried, widowed, or divorced. It's tempting for the elder to step in and kind of take over. But that's not our place or our right, is it? Elders have been warned repeatedly of getting too closely involved in a situation like this. There are moral and even psychological, emotional dangers in such a charged situation. Elisha wisely asks the widow, "Tell me, what do you have in the house?" In other words, before I give you some advice or even do something in a practical way, what might you already have to help yourself? That sets a good example. Of course, he didn't put her off. He could sense her fear, her despair, and took immediate steps to respond to her. Whatever he might have been doing before she approached him, he gave no indication of being annoyed or put out. That, too, is a good example. So elders and fathers, how do you respond when someone in your family or in the congregation asks you for help? Are you ready to do good when it's in the power of your hands to do it? Or are you inclined to hold back when maybe you could provide assistance? Remember how James reminds us in James 1:27 that our whole form of worship is futile if we don't willingly take care of the needs of others, especially widows and orphans in the congregation. Well, Elisha asks her what he can do. What does she have? She says, I just have a spouted jar of oil. What does Elisha do about it? Well, let's continue with verses 3 and 4. Then he said, Go, ask for vessels from yourself from outside, from all your neighbors, empty vessels. Do not hold yourself to a few. And you must go and close the door behind yourself and your sons, and you must pour out into all these vessels, and the full ones you should set aside. Upon that she went away from him. Well, certainly I think you'll agree these were strange instructions. Imagine yourself in this widow's shoes. If you were her, would you have accepted at face value what Elisha told you to do? Would you have followed immediately his direction? Or might you have questioned him, finding it foolish, unreasonable, impractical? Our prayers, I think you'll agree, aren't always answered right away or even in the way that we expect, and that can test our faith. On the one hand, we might be earnestly praying to Jehovah to help us to resolve a particular crisis or problem in our life, when in fact, there may be things that we need to do first before Jehovah responds and helps us out. Or we might be praying regularly for direction on a matter, while in reality, in our own minds, we've already made up our minds what we want to do or what we think needs to be done. In some situations, our sense of what to do is so strong that without even realizing it, we push ahead with our own plans and stop taking notice of Jehovah. This background noise, as I like to think of it, of our own imperfect thinking, can sometimes become so loud that even if Jehovah is speaking to us, we can't hear him because our own will is so strongly directing us on what to do. It's funny, but when we do that, I know I've had that experience in my own life, and then things don't turn out quite as we expect, our first reaction might be to blame Jehovah, when in fact, we never really followed his direction in the first place. We didn't even give him a chance to direct us. In any case, you can see how we need to be careful when Jehovah gives us direction to really listen. One sister who felt that her prayers weren't being answered later discovered that they really, in fact, were. How did she learn that? Well, she decided in her discouragement to begin keeping a written diary of everything she prayed about every day. And then one day, some months later, she just pulled the notebook off of her dresser and began flipping through it and reading it. And she was struck by the fact that Jehovah had answered most of her prayers, even the ones that she had completely forgotten about. And this convinced her that Jehovah was, in fact, caring for her and answering her prayers in a tender way. Why hadn't she realized it before? Simply because her own anxiety, her own distress was crowding her ability to see Jehovah's hand in her life. So if you feel at times discouraged with Jehovah's response to your prayers, why not try this and see whether or not Jehovah really is listening to you? Evidently, if this Israelite widow had had any doubts about Jehovah's direction to her, she didn't let that stop her from following his direction. Let's pick up the account in the second half of verse 5. She went away from him, we're told, and when she closed the door behind herself and her sons, they were bringing the vessels near to her, and she was doing the pouring out. So you see, this widow's strong faith helped her to put her fears and doubts aside, and she carefully followed Elisha's instructions. Now, do you imagine that Jehovah would have blessed her on this occasion had she decided to do things her own way? Imagine if she had gone away from Elisha and gone home, as he told her, but instead of going out and collecting the vessels and bringing them home and using her little spouted jar as she had been told, she instead also asked the neighbors for a little bit of oil. I need help. Can you help me out? I'm making a collection from my neighbors for some oil. Well, she probably would have gotten a little bit of oil, wouldn't she? But could she have said that this was an answer to her prayers? Could she have said that this was Jehovah's blessing? Is it likely that she would have gotten enough oil that way to really resolve her needs? I wonder. We too cannot expect Jehovah's blessing if we ignore His direction in our life. We certainly can't expect Him to spare us from the unfavorable consequences of decisions that we make that disregard His principles or direction. I think it's interesting, too, that we're told here that her two sons worked right alongside her. And as I read this, I wonder, for all of you parents here, would your children have followed your lead in doing something like this? Do they follow your lead in spiritual things today? For example, how do they respond when you call them for the family study? Or to go out in service? Or it's time to come and clean the kingdom hall? Are they happy? Are they responsive? Diligence in training your children from when they're very young pays off when they get older. This widow's boys were likely teenagers. We can say that because they were able to help her collect and manage these vessels. And the kinds of vessels they used in the homes in these days to handle liquids were large clay pots about this high and about this around. They were heavy. Your little children wouldn't be able to move those things around. So her boys were probably already teenagers. You know how teenage boys can be when you ask them to do something. They could easily have resisted her efforts or just begged off. I gotta go play with my friends. But they didn't. So this couple had evidently trained their children well with spiritual appreciation. Well, our young ones today need strong faith too, I think you'll agree, especially when they get into their teen years. They face so many tests and distractions from Satan's system. Only a strong personal relationship with Jehovah is going to protect them when they're not around you, when they're not with their brothers in the congregation. So, parents, a good lesson from the widow is take the time to train your children now. Spend time with them every day talking about Jehovah. Let them hear your prayers and listen carefully to theirs. It'll tell you a lot about how their relationship is developing. If possible, pioneer with them. At the very least, tell them over and over again how Jehovah has blessed you, provided for you in your life, so that they can see that this is real and not just something they hear about, not just empty promises. Let them know how you, as their parent, feels about Jehovah and why you trust Him. Make Jehovah as real to them as He was to young Joseph, Moses, the 3 Hebrews, and this widow's 2 sons. That could be the greatest gift you parents ever give your children. Well, what came of their efforts? Let's finish the account. We have just 2 more verses to go. In verse 6 it says, "And it came about that as soon as the vessels were full, she went on to say to her son, 'Do bring still another vessel near to me.' But he said to her, 'There is no other vessel.' At that, the oil stopped. So she came in and told the man of the true God, and he now said, 'Go, sell the oil and pay off your debts, and you and your sons should live from what is left.' So the widow does what she's told, and the oil from her little spouted jar of oil does not run out until all of these large vessels they had gathered are full. At that, the Bible says the oil stopped. And that reminds me that Jehovah's blessing is always in relation to our real need. Jehovah promises to provide us what we need in our situation and not more. Now, I have to admit, at least that's my experience, sometimes Jehovah spoils us and gives us much more than what we need. But remember, brothers and sisters, that right now, prior to Armageddon, complete satisfaction of all of our needs and wants is not on the books. That's for the future. That's when His kingdom is ruling over the earth. Right now, Jesus promised, Matthew 6:33, that we can rightly expect food, clothing, shelter, if we put God's kingdom and His righteousness first in our lives. And He always delivers, as Jesus promised. I also find it interesting that Elisha told her to first go and pay off her debts before living off the proceeds, the remaining proceeds from her sale. And that reminds us that economic hardship is no excuse for taking advantage of others materially, especially of our brothers and sisters. We can't expect our landlord to pay our rent or our brothers to forgive our debts just because we fall on hard times. Now, sometimes they do that of their own generosity and kindness, and that's a wonderful thing, and we appreciate it. But it's not their obligation to do so. It's our responsibility to take care of our debts. Yet Jehovah will help us if we turn to Him in faith. And that's what the widow learned. She could have approached the king with her problem. That was an arrangement in ancient Israel. She could have gone to a wealthy relative for help. But she didn't. She turned to Jehovah, not out of desperation, but because she had the faith to know that Jehovah would provide. And she was not disappointed. She had a long record of faithfulness, and she knew Jehovah appreciated that, and that stood her in good stead during this difficult time of her life. In turn, Jehovah blessed her beyond her wildest dreams. It seems that He provided her with sufficient means to pay off her debts, provide for her family, and still stay in the full-time service, because we don't read of her having to give up her position in the community of the sons of the prophets. A wonderful blessing, unexpected. And brothers, Jehovah can and will help each and every one of us overcome our trials and bless us beyond our wildest dreams if only we put faith in Him. Why? Because blessings come to faithful people. Now, looking back on your life in the truth, maybe you've been in the truth 5 years, 10 years, maybe it's 50 years, you may not think that anything of great consequence like this has happened to you because of your faithfulness. The psalmist Asaph, at one point in his life, felt that way. He said at Psalm 73, "Surely it is in vain that I have cleansed my heart, and that I wash my hands in innocence itself." But by whose standards was he judging his success? Were the wicked really prospering more than he was? What did he want out of life? Later on, Asaph confessed, "My steps had nearly been made to slip." The truth is, when we give our brains mixed messages, we tend to get mixed results in life. And that leads us to our next point. You get what you focus on. Perhaps you've noticed that successful people in any endeavor know exactly what they want. They see their goals clearly, and they take purposeful action towards meeting them. They also resist getting distracted, even by things that may be out of their control. In a word, we might say they're disciplined. Most of us, though, honestly, are a little different. Our goals and priorities are unclear to us, or sometimes worse, conflicting with each other. So we're often immobilized or even paralyzed by our fears, by our lack of certainty, and we're too easily distracted. In a word, we might say we are unfocused. And when it comes to being blessed by Jehovah, this distinction is crucial. Jehovah reminded the Israelites, you may remember at Deuteronomy 28, when Moses was laying out really the sum total of Jehovah's law and its consequences, and the consequences of obedience to it to the Israelites, that blessings or maledictions would surely overtake them depending on whether or not they obeyed. Well, this is exactly what happened to them in their life. Notice what Psalm 109:17 says about one Israelite's experience in this connection. In effect, as the psalmist explains, he got what he focused on, and his experience can teach us some valuable lessons. Psalm 109:17 says that this Israelite kept loving the malediction so that it came upon him. And he did not take delight in the blessing, so that it became far away from him, just as Moses had promised. A malediction, of course, is just the opposite of a blessing. It literally means speaking evil or ill of someone. So why was it that maledictions caught up with this man, while blessings kept far away from him? Well, it was, as the psalm says, because he kept loving the malediction, or he kept pursuing it. He kept focusing on it. The truth is, we are attracted to whatever we focus on in life. And if we focus on something long enough, we're likely to get or obtain it. On the one hand, if we focus on spiritual things, we attract Jehovah's blessings in our life. On the other hand, if we dwell on wrong desires or imperfect pursuits, then we attract the unpleasant consequences that go along with sin. In each case, as we draw closer to one, there's a tendency to push the other away. It's like the opposite poles of a magnet. Blessings and maledictions oppose each other. When we attract one, we push the other away, and vice versa. Now, the Israelite widow likely tried to resolve her financial problems on her own before she approached Elisha. Just think about it. Being hopelessly in debt is embarrassing and distressing. And if any of you have had that experience, you know what I mean. Who wants to admit he can't pay his bills? It's a terrible position to be in. So likely she had taken some steps before coming to Elisha. But whatever she had done to try to resolve the situation, it just wasn't working. It might be that her husband had incurred some debt while he was still alive. But the implication of the account in 2 Kings is that things got much worse after his death. And sometimes today, that's true when husbands handle all of the money matters in a family, and their wives, their spouse, is completely ignorant of how things are cared for. After a divorce or a bereavement, the wives may struggle with trying to take care of these practical affairs. So loving husbands do well to take practical steps to prepare for unfortunate accident or illnesses and help their families to cope in these situations. In any case, the widow eventually reaches the breaking point in trying to solve the situation on her own, and she desperately dumps her situation before Jehovah's representative. The account says that she cried out to Elisha, so we get the sense of how frustrated and discouraged she literally was. Perhaps she was starting to feel a little bit like a failure. When one thing goes wrong after another in our life, in a situation, it's easy to start feeling that way. Why can't I handle the money matters better? Why can't I discipline the children like when my husband was here? Why can't I keep up with my theocratic routine, we ask ourselves. We start saying, am I weak? Is there something wrong with me? Am I a failure? Am I being punished? Have I done something wrong? And if we're not careful, these negative thoughts can start us down a downward spiral of self-deprecation and fault-finding that eventually leads to depression. Before long, our situation seems completely hopeless. Or it may be that the widow was starting to feel a little cheated by life. After all, she and her husband had spent many years together in Jehovah's service. They had made sacrifices to keep their life simple so they could be used in this way. They had given up the so-called normal life that most Israelites had at that time, including a family homestead and inheritance for their children. After all this, was this how she was to be treated? She had already lost her husband. Was she to lose her home and her children too? This didn't seem fair. I'm sure you'll agree. Any one of us might feel that way in her shoes. The point is, if the widow would have continued to focus on such anxious and fearful thoughts, she would surely have lost her spiritual balance. She might even eventually become embittered or enraged against Jehovah God. But fortunately, Elisha got her to refocus her thoughts before they took her further down this path. He said, "What do you have in the house?" In other words, what do you have that Jehovah could use to help you? And that question stopped her thoughts in their tracks. Immediately, her whole outlook on her situation changed. When she stopped fixating on her problems and refocused on what Jehovah could do and would do for her, as he had done in the past, it was as if a cloud of despair lifted off of her shoulders. Upon that, the account says next, she went away from him and went straight to work, putting the prophet's direction into action. And before long, we find her so involved in filling up these vessels that they had gathered that she didn't even notice that they were all full. She said to her son, "Do bring still another vessel to me." But of course, there were no more. The crisis was over. Jehovah had provided a solution for her. Even her anxiety is gone. And that is the power of focus. As a young kid, I was fascinated for a while, as I think most boys are, with burning holes into things with a magnifying glass in the sun. Have you ever tried doing that when you were young? I don't know what it is about boys and fire, but most of us play with it for a while. When you hold up a magnifying glass to the sun, and you concentrate the sun's rays through that glass into a single point, you can burn a hole through a stick, a leaf, a piece of cloth, almost anything. It's amazing how you can concentrate the power of the sun into a single point like that. And so it is too in our minds and our hearts. Whatever we focus on will have a tendency to concentrate our thoughts, our desires, our motives, whether for the good or for the bad. We get what we focus on. That's why our choice of goals in life is so important. You hear the organization talking about goals all the time. This is why it's so vital. The clearer our goals are, the stronger our focus is. And the stronger our focus, the more likely we are to achieve our goals. If we set spiritual goals in our life and we focus on them, then we're sure to achieve them despite the ups and downs of this system of things. The blessings are, in fact, attracted to us, as the psalmist and as Moses indicated. They will, as Jehovah promised through Moses, eventually overtake us. But it's just as true that if we let selfish concerns predominate in our thinking, or if we allow improper desires to grow in our hearts, we are just as sure to end up in wrongdoing of one sort or another. You can't stop that process. And then the associated maledictions, likewise, will eventually overtake us. I want to illustrate this further by going back to Psalm 109:17. I hope your Bible's still open there. This psalm is, in fact, a messianic prophecy of things that would occur in Jesus' life while he was here on earth. The context here reveals that the unrighteous man in verse 17, in fact, would turn out to be someone we all know, Judas Iscariot, who slandered, betrayed, and eventually pursued innocent blood to the point of death. Now, in knowing this additional detail about verse 17, look at it again. In what way did Judas keep loving the malediction so that it came upon him? Well, the Apostle John later explained in his gospel that Judas was a thief. He didn't start out that way, of course. When Jesus invited him into his company and later as an apostle, he was a good man, but he became a thief over time. Evidently, according to John, he took care of the money box that Jesus and his apostles carried around with them to help pay for their expenses and to be able to give alms to the poor. But while honest people were making contributions thinking that these were advancing the kingdom work, John tells us that Judas used to carry off the monies that were put in it. Now think about that. Think about what that does to a heart. It takes time and frequent repetition to deaden a Bible-trained conscience like that. However Judas got started stealing, we don't know, but we know that his continued focus on ill-gotten gain stimulated his wrong desire to such a degree that eventually he was prepared to consider doing something he would never have imagined earlier in his life. He decided later on to betray his master, the Son of God, for just 30 lousy pieces of silver. See, that's the power of focus. And what happened to Jehovah's blessing? As Judas moved further and further down this path, well, Jehovah's blessing moved farther and farther away from him, didn't it? Think of what Judas turned his back on. Companionship with God's Son. The privilege to use God's power of Holy Spirit to perform miracles. His office of oversight or apostleship. Because he continued to focus on wrong desires, these blessings moved further and further away from him. The deeper he went into sin, the farther Jehovah's favor receded from him. The more he lived a lie, the stronger Satan's hold became on him. In fact, as you read the gospel accounts, see if you don't agree with me, the closer you get to the end of Judas' life, the more he seems like an outsider among the rest of the apostles. Right before his betrayal, he seems to be just going through the motions. He's not part of the spirit of the rest of what was going on between Jesus and the other 11. He's an outsider. He's put himself there. Even though Jesus repeatedly tried to help him right up to the last few hours, he was beyond redemption. At first it seemed maybe to some that Judas might outrun the maledictions that Jehovah had promised from such a course, but true to Jehovah's word, they eventually caught up and overtook him. He paid a terrible price. Once the full magnitude of what he did, his unforgivable sin, sank in on him, he threw the blood money he had received back into the temple and ran off to commit suicide. What a tragic ending to a life that had began so full of promise. So what's the lesson for us, friends? Well, all of us have weaknesses. Let's be honest. What is a temptation to one, of course, might not be a temptation to another, but this process of focus applies to us all. What do we choose to focus on in our life? Do financial gain, career advancement, retirement planning consume us? Well, then be careful, because selfishness, greed, and corruption will not be far behind. Or are we rather content with a simple life in order to pursue spiritual goals? Well, then be assured that just as surely kindness, contentment, and integrity will overtake us. Really, all of this is just another way of saying what Galatians 6 and verse 7 says so well, that you will reap what you sow. If we focus on our imperfect desires, sooner or later, we will give in to temptation. Likewise, if we focus on our personal problems, sooner or later, we will give in to despair. But just as certain, if we focus on Jehovah and doing His will in our life, He will bless us with peace of mind and heart that is beyond all human thinking. And He will give us all that we really need to be happy right now, right here. Because when it comes to blessings from Jehovah, we will get what we focus on. Having clear goals, but not putting forth a sustained effort to achieve them, is like a road map, but having no vehicle to get there. It's almost useless. While having the right focus can keep you pointed in the right direction, it's only by consistent effort on our part that will actually make progress towards our goals. And that brings us to our third and final principle we want to talk about. See, you got to keep track. There's 3. When it comes to spiritual blessings, you always get back more than what you give. And that's consistent with the principle of reciprocity that underpins all of Jehovah's creation. Think about it. Everything that Jehovah made works in continuous cycles of renewal and replenishment. The water cycle, the agricultural cycle, the food chain. Each step supports the next, until eventually it all comes back around again to the beginning and the cycle starts all over again. That's the way Jehovah made things. And in a sense, it's also true when it comes to relationships. In Satan's system, you can work hard for an employer, for a cause, even on a marriage, and end up getting little or nothing back. But it's not that way when we do things for Jehovah or for anyone who is like him. Jesus said, "For with the measure you are measuring out, they will measure out to you in return." Or he also put it this way, there is more happiness in giving than there is in receiving. Reciprocity basically means that you get what you give. In fact, when it comes to spiritual blessings, the more you give, the more you get from Jehovah. The Apostle Paul illustrated this principle for us with one of God's creative arrangements, the agricultural cycle. Read with me at 2 Corinthians 9 and verse 6 to see how this principle works in real life. 2 Corinthians 9 and 6. Paul says, "But as to this," that's gaining blessings from God, "he that sows sparingly will also reap sparingly, and he that sows bountifully will also reap bountifully." So the more we sow, the more we reap. It's as simple as that. Now think again about the Israelite widow. She asked for a blessing. But did she get a miraculous check in the mail just for asking, making a prayer, making a request? No, of course not. She was told to go and work for that blessing. Elisha said, "Go, ask for vessels from your neighbors. Do not hold yourself to a few." That's significant. Think about it. How many vessels should she and her son have gathered? She wasn't told how many. It was entirely up to her. And it appears in this case, as is the case in so many other instances when you think about it, the degree of her blessing was limited only by the extent of her own efforts. Jehovah was ready to bless her, but the degree depended on what she was willing to give. The more jars she gathered, the more oil she would have received. If she held back from doing her best, what could she hope to obtain? When the miraculous oil stopped flowing, do you think she might have said to herself or her sons, "We should have gathered a few more jars"? I know I might have. But in any case, it's clear from the way the account ends up that they had put forth their best effort because, in the end, they had enough. They had enough to satisfy their needs. Brothers, we shouldn't think of Jehovah like the proverbial genie of the lamp. We can't expect when we have a problem to just rub the lamp of prayer once and say, "I'm in trouble, I need help," and presto, Jehovah's going to satisfy our needs. That attitude would be both disrespectful and unrealistic. It denies the way in which Jehovah made us and the whole world around us, the way he operates. And it really wouldn't be good for us either. From the beginning, Satan has fostered the lie that Jehovah is a capricious despot and that humans are his helpless victims. That's what he convinced Eve, really, when you think about it. Satan convinced her that Jehovah was deceiving her and holding back from her what she really deserved. He told her, "If you continue to give your obedience and loyalty and trust to Jehovah, you'll never be happy. Take what you deserve. God knows that in the very day of your eating from it, your eyes are bound to be open and you're bound to be like God." Well, Eve, of course, bought into that lie. And by doing so, she brought herself, her husband, and all of their future offspring under the terrible influence of Satan's greed and conceit. Subsequently, Satan has abused all of us down to this very day. Rather than bring her the greater freedom she wanted, independence from God made her feel more helpless. She lived to see her eldest son kill his brother. She lived to see the breakdown of the marriage arrangement, probably her own, as Jehovah predicted there would be friction between her and her husband. And she lived to see a widespread disrespect for Jehovah's name and the consequences that brought in human society. What a legacy for her selfishness. Since then, the prospects of a better life have only gotten worse, at least from a human standpoint. And so today it's not uncommon for us to hear people say, why try to do the right thing? What's the point? It doesn't make a difference. We're all going to die. You may as well get what you can out of life. Researchers have labeled this response as learned helplessness. And it's widespread in human society today. Early and repeated disappointments in life tend to leave people feeling increasingly helpless, unloved, and sometimes even unlovable. Even Christians respond this way at times. We might believe that God's kingdom is real, it's ruling. We might tell other people it's going to come soon and address the world's problems, but when it comes to our personal situation, our own immediate problems, we might similarly feel helpless and overwhelmed. For example, an elder named Rick told me during one year, it seemed as though everything that could go wrong did. I started to get depressed and began thinking that for some reason, Jehovah didn't want me anymore. Sound familiar? Or Dave, a father of 4, remembers a time when it seemed impossible to make ends meet financially. He says, this caused tremendous stress on our marriage, and for a period of time we wondered if we had lost God's blessing. Kathy, too, a victim of child abuse, admits, for a very long time, I felt that I didn't have Jehovah's blessing on any part of my life. I felt that Jehovah could never want someone as wicked as me to be one of his witnesses. Likewise, when the Israelite widow approached Elisha at first, did you detect a note of desperation in her voice? Do you remember what she said? Her opening words carry a note of personal rejection and resignation. She said, what can you do for me, in effect, and not, what else might I do to help myself? And this kind of response is typical of those who've learned to be helpless out of frustration and disappointment. Again, think about Elisha's response. He immediately asked her, what do you have in the house? In other words, before you expect Jehovah to step in and help you, and he will, what do you already have that he might be able to use to help you? What are you willing to give for a blessing? And that question got her thinking. When she willingly let go of that last symbol of her self-reliance, that small spouted jar of oil, she got a wonderful blessing in return. And isn't that what Jehovah promised through Malachi in Malachi 3:10 when he told his people, bring in all the 10th parts into the storehouse and test me out, please, in this respect, whether I shall not open to you, people, the floodgates of the heavens and actually empty out upon you a blessing until there is no more want. When we give our all to Jehovah, he blesses us in return, richly. The more we give, the more we get. And this was true in the widow's case. It will likewise be true for us. The Bible is literally full of examples of this principle in action. Remember how Jacob struggled all night with that angel for a blessing? He wasn't disappointed. Or remember how Elisha told Joash to strike the ground with his arrows. But remember, Joash feebly struck 3 times, and Elisha was indignant. He said it was meant to strike 5 or 6 times. In that case, you would have struck Syria down to the finishing point. Do you see the common denominator in all of these Bible accounts, brothers and sisters? Jehovah often does not answer our prayers right away because he's giving us the opportunity to demonstrate the depth of our faith, our obedience, and our diligence to work in harmony with those prayers. How much are we willing to give? That's the question. Jehovah has the ability to help any of us accomplish any task. That's not the problem. But only we can choose to give him our faithfulness, our obedience. So never would we want personal pride or discouragement or other negative feelings to make us give up on Jehovah. Do you want to go to Bethel, to Pioneer, to attend the ministerial training school or Gilead? Then keep on applying as long as you can. Are you struggling with financial problems or deteriorating health or personality conflicts with another? Then keep on fighting to keep these tests from overwhelming you spiritually. The Apostle Paul confidently told his brothers, in due season we shall reap if we do not tire out. Ultimately, all of us need to be ready to show the depth of our confidence in Jehovah God in His mighty arm of salvation. He will not let us down if we do so. Could we be asking Jehovah to help us with something while at the same time we're holding back some of our time, our energy, or our other assets for our own pursuits? If so, is it reasonable to expect Jehovah to pour out a blessing until there is no more want? On the other hand, what if, like the widow, we put our full trust in Jehovah, work diligently in harmony with our prayers? Well then, as Jehovah promised, miracles can happen. I want to share one more example with you to illustrate this point. When Andrew and Anne first married, Anne's eyes lighted up every time she was in Andrew's presence, and anyone could see how much Andrew doted on his wife. But after only 7 years of marriage, things began to unravel for these two. Andrew got a new job that consumed a lot of his time, and before long he was coming home from work with alcohol in his breath. He told Anne he had been out with some of the business associates after work. Well, understandably, Anne began to resent his new preoccupation with his job, and especially the frequent late nights and this growing drinking problem that she perceived in her husband. As the drinking got worse, she decided to move out for a time, hoping to shock him to his senses, but the opposite happened. He quickly spiraled down into depression, and within only a few months, the couple was divorced. Now, Andrew and Anne were both Christians. They were both Jehovah's Witnesses, and like all of us here this afternoon, they revered marriage as being sacred from Jehovah. But every year, this world's twisted thinking influences thousands of witness couples to divorce for reasons that are less than scriptural. And many of them come to realize too late that they've been caught in a trap. Andrew and Anne began to realize this after they were divorced. They saw that they really had made a dreadful mistake. But happily for them, amazingly we might say, it wasn't too late. They actually sought each other out again and got remarried. And today they're happily raising 2 delightful children in the truth. At the time their experience was related, Andrew was serving as a ministerial servant, and the whole family was making good spiritual progress. What interested me, though, is what changed. Why could the same 2 people be successful now when they could not keep it together earlier? Well, here's what they said. Andrew said, "I realized that I was morally bankrupt and that I needed help. And for the first time in years, I really prayed about the situation. I wanted to do what was right. And so I knew I had to reject all the values I had picked up in the world." Anne adds this thought. She says, "The reason we can be together now with that horrible past behind us is that both of us really wanted to be right with Jehovah. And we really wanted to make it work." Of course, it hasn't been easy for them. She says, "We constantly watch our relationship like a guard dog, and if one of us feels it's drifting, we immediately talk things over to set things right." Do you see the point, though? What made the difference for these two? That winning combination of perseverance and diligent effort working in harmony with earnest prayers is what is absolutely essential if we're going to retain Jehovah's blessing in our life. When it comes to our marriage, for example, do we really appreciate how much Jehovah hates a divorcing? Or has the world's thinking began to erode our sense of that? Even if there's only a spark of love left in our marriage, like that little spouted jar of oil that the widow had, seemingly nothing left to work with, do you think that Jehovah could use that little spark of love to help put our marriage back together like He blessed that Israelite widow? Of course He can, if we're willing to work along with His direction. It's not so much the events in our lives that really shape us, brothers, but it's our beliefs about what those events mean. If you believe that you're helpless, you'll likely find that to be true. But as Jesus said, if you have faith the size of a mustard grain, the tiniest of all seeds, nothing will be impossible for you. Like that Israelite widow, like Andrew and Ann, like the countless of others of Jehovah's people, when it comes to spiritual blessings, the more you are willing to give for a blessing, the more you will get from Jehovah. None of this will matter to you, of course, if you're not ready to give more to Jehovah. Unfortunately, the world today, people are concerned more about getting than they are about giving, but we're different, aren't we, as Jehovah's people? What about us? What are we really willing to give for a spiritual blessing? All of us face trials that can test our faith and trust in Jehovah, yet I hope the Israelite widow's experience gives you hope. We've learned that blessings come to faithful people. If we put our full trust in Jehovah and are willing to follow theocratic direction in our lives, we too will get blessings. We've learned that we get what we focus on. We have to work against the imperfect human tendency to rely on ourselves, to give in to self-pity, or to cater to our imperfect desires. That can be dangerous. It can draw us towards malediction. Focus instead on spiritual things, our spiritual activities, and they will draw us closer to Jehovah. Finally, we've also learned that the more we give to Jehovah, the more we get back from Him. So we need to be honest about our desires, motives, and affections. In Rick's case, the brother I mentioned a moment ago, he says the obstacle, really, I have to admit, was my own thinking. I had become so depressed that I let my spirituality slip. But after confiding in other spiritually mature men in the congregation, he was able to adjust his thinking and resolve his problems. Now, he says, I have become convinced that no matter what faces us, the most precious thing is our relationship with Jehovah. If we endure, He always provides the way out. Dave also came to a similar conclusion after selling his house and moving to more modest quarters. He was unexpectedly given a promotion at work that also gave him more freedom. So he said, I learned from that Jehovah will always provide. This may not come at a time we expect or in a way that we were thinking of, but it will come when Jehovah feels it's appropriate. He will not let us be tested beyond what we can bear. And Kathy, too, was able to overcome eventually her feelings of worthlessness with the help of loving elders. Even though it took years for her to come to grips fully with these problems, she says she learned some valuable lessons. The problems that I went through, Kathy says, have helped me to be more understanding and compassionate to others. I hope that in some way my experience can help others who feel that they could never have Jehovah's blessing. I now know that it is possible to receive those blessings. So once again, in each of their cases, Rick, Dave, Kathy, they did something specific to show Jehovah how much they wanted a blessing, how much they needed a blessing. They spoke to an elder, sold their house, started pioneering, and so on. Once they took steps in harmony with their prayers, Jehovah responded in measure beyond their wildest dreams. So too, friends, start measuring your life based on results and not just intentions. Don't let yourself be dominated by fear. Put your full trust in Jehovah and be ready to work for a blessing. Identify what you want from Him in clear detail and then take purposeful action towards your goals. In conclusion, let's read together the heartwarming promise that's recorded at Proverbs 10 and 22. Because really, when it comes to the things that matter in life, nothing can be truer than Solomon's inspired words here. Proverbs 10 and 22, the blessing of Jehovah, that is what makes rich, and He adds no pain with it. If you are convinced of the surpassing value of spiritual blessing, friends, if you view them as did the merchant in Jesus' illustration who, when seeking fine pearls, found one and then went off and sold all the things that he had to buy that one pearl, then you too will let nothing interfere with or hold you back from seeking divine blessings. You will not let personal wants, expectations, or desires stand in the way of your spiritual goals. You'll appreciate whatever theocratic assignments and privileges you have because you know they're a way to open up yourself to Jehovah's Holy Spirit and the blessings that result. Brothers, always be ready to give Jehovah your very best, and He will be sure to give you in return the requests of your heart.
We thank you, obviously, very much, Brother Reinmueller, for that, and we appreciate you and your wife coming here, traveling all this way, and the fine group we had here this evening from members from, I think, all the congregations here in Waco. Some of us are all here, so we certainly enjoy that. Let you know that two brothers and sisters, the Reinmuellers, will be with us again tomorrow in Westview, and the meeting begins at 10 in the morning, and the theme of that talk is, are you doing what God requires? And after a shortened watchtower, Brother Reinmueller will share with us a short spiritual thought, too. So we have a nice meeting scheduled tomorrow. Brothers and sisters, you showed your appreciation for Brother Reinmueller's talk. What do you think about showing your appreciation for the provision of the governing body and allowing these brothers to travel and to do this for us? Jehovah heard that, and Brother Reinmueller, if it ever comes up, you can tell him we do appreciate that provision. You never know when that'll come up. Okay, well, we'd like to end our meeting. We have plenty to talk about afterwards now, don't we? Let's stand together, and we'll sing song number 40, after which Brother Reinmueller will close with prayer for us. Song 40, Making Our Way 6th.